They do not join. They are taken. In the far reaches of the Imperium, where billions of unnoticed lives grind beneath the machinery of survival, ordinary citizens go to sleep one night as workers, farmers, students, and mothers, and awaken the next day as numbers in a ledger of war. The Arbites arrive without warning. Sirens split the night air. Doors are kicked open. In the name of the Emperor, adults and teenagers alike are seized at gunpoint, dragged from their homes. Their cries swallowed by armored vehicles and cold metallic orders. The last thing many see of their former life is a fading image of family, a hand reaching, separated by riot shields and iron hands. The journey into conscription is not a march of pride, but a transportation of despair. They are crammed into sealed transports, shoulder to shoulder, breathing recycled air thick with fear. Some shout demands, others weep silently. Most eventually fall into a stunned quiet, realizing their fate is no longer their own. The guards never speak except to command. The recruits speak only in whispers, trading rumors that no one can verify. They say the guard trains you by killing the weak, or no one returns, even survivors are changed. Hope does not travel with them, only uncertainty. When they reach the first processing station, humanity begins to be stripped away. Names are replaced with numerical identifiers. Civilian clothing is confiscated and burned. Heads are shaved. Bodies are inspected and noted. Servo skulls with Vox speakers drone endlessly, reciting the tenets of service, the virtues of sacrifice, the holiness of obedience. A simple phrase begins to echo in every mind. You are not a person anymore. The Imperium does not foster identity. It eradicates it. In this place, you do not stand out. You disappear into the mass of future casualties. Fear gives way to numbness. Most stop resisting. Some stop thinking. A few pray, though even prayer feels meaningless when every corridor reverberates with the mechanical voices of indoctrination. In a single night, they have gone from civilians with histories to faceless instruments of war. The Imperium does not ask whether a human wants to fight. It only asks whether they can bleed. And the recruits begin to understand the truth. They were not chosen for their ability to win wars, but for their ability to be spent in them. The transport vehicles rumble like prison coffins, moving through the night with headlamps off, as if ashamed of their cargo. Inside, the conscripted sit crushed together, knees touching, shoulders pressing, some still trembling from the shock of the arrest. The only light comes from thin slits in the armored plating, showing glimpses of blurred city lights passing by, the last traces of civilization they will ever see. Every bump in the road causes heads to jolt and ribs to grind. Some beg quietly, making promises to the soldiers guarding them. But the guards do not answer, their helmets face front, unreadable. Hours stretch like days. The movement becomes rhythmic, disorienting, hypnotic. Sleep comes in brief spasms, shattered by sudden stops, by barked commands, by distant screams that echo outside the metal hull. Through the slits, the recruits see crowds, neighbors, mothers, siblings, held behind barricades, kept away by shock troopers. Some wave desperately, others collapse in grief. A few simply stare, resigned, having witnessed too many such roundups before. The young conscripts inside want to shout, but silence feels safer than hope. Rumors flow like whispers of poison. One man claims he heard that only 1 in 5 trainees survives the process. Another mutters that recruits are sent against horrors not even soldiers are prepared for. Someone insists other transports never made it to their destination at all. The uncertainty is psychological torture. Every story could be true. Every guess could be a warning. The transport feels like a womb for nightmares, carrying not soldiers, but sacrifices. Old lives feel distant, fading like dreams. Eventually, the vehicles emerge into long stretches of industrial wasteland. The windows reveal nothing but smokestacks, ash drifting through the air, and skeletal structures of abandoned manufactoria. Civilization has been left behind, replaced by landscapes where even the sun seems absent. The message is clear, without being spoken. There is no going back. In this place, no one cares who these people were. Their histories are erased, their futures mortgaged to warfare. Every mile of distance is a mile of forgetting, until memory itself becomes a traitor. A moment the transport doors open, the recruits are greeted not by instructions, but by orders barked through loudspeakers that distort every syllable into something harsh and metallic. They are herded through narrow corridors lit by flickering lumens, the walls lined with purity seals and inspection banners. There's no room for hesitation. Any pause, any question is met with a shove from a rifle butt. They reach a chamber where civilians file through like livestock being processed. Boots on metal flooring echo endlessly, reinforcing the sense that they are entering a realm where individuality is noise, and the Imperium demands silence. The stripping begins. Personal possessions are confiscated. Photographs of families, religious charms, letters, even sentimental trinkets, all are tossed into a chute that incinerates them instantly. Some try to protest. A young woman begs for the return of a keepsake necklace, but she is slapped to the ground and dragged aside. A loudspeaker proclaims, "Worldly attachments weaken loyalty to the Emperor." Clothing is cut from their bodies. Uniforms, with rough, ill-fitting fabric, replace them. In a span of minutes, decades of personal history are reduced to ash and forgotten fibers. Next comes the reduction to classification. Names are replaced by strings of numerals. Inked stamps mark forearms with regiment identification codes. A man attempts to keep saying his name, Jonas Hale, Jonas Hale, until a commissar levels a pistol at his temple and demands the number instead. He stammers it through tears. The moment he speaks the numbers, the soldier lowers the gun. The lesson is unmistakable. Names have no meaning here. Identity is a threat to obedience. The recruits begin repeating their numbers in their minds, the Emperor's new liturgy of self-erasure. Medical inspection follows, brutal in its efficiency. Tech adepts with servo skulls hover, embedding needles and scanners into flesh. Scars, injuries, weaknesses, all logged without comment. The process is impersonal, clinical, almost ritualistic. A man with a minor genetic defect is removed from the line and never seen again. Another with poor muscle definition is injected with stimulant compounds and shoved onward. No explanation is given. They are not evaluated as humans, but as assets, consumable instruments of war. Biological viability is the only currency that matters. By the time they reach the final chamber, the recruits feel hollowed out, less like survivors and more like exiles from their own pasts. A massive aquila spans the wall, illuminated by cruel spotlights. Servo skulls circle overhead reciting the same phrase, You belong to the Imperium of Man. The civilians stand there, shaved, labeled, inspected, stripped bare of memories, stripped even of names, and they finally understand. The transformation has already begun. They are no longer who they were, and the Imperium has no intention of ever letting them remember. The first steps onto the parade grounds were a shock to Marcus. Drill sergeants screamed like beasts, their voices cutting through the air with merciless precision. Commissars prowled between the lines, their eyes cold, unblinking, and judgmental. The smell of sweat, dust, and iron from old blood hung thick, clinging to every uniform. Rations were pitiful, thin gruel that barely filled the stomach, forcing him to march on an empty belly. Every movement was punished if flawed. A misstep, a pause, a hesitation. Pain became constant, a companion, as cracked ribs and burning muscles reminded him he was not allowed to fail. Recruits who collapsed were dragged away silently, their absence noted only as empty space in the formation. Marcus dreamt of home, the factory, his sister's laughter, but the visions were cruelly interrupted by the relentless drill. Survival demanded surrender. Hours blended into endless repetition. Forced marches carried them across rocky terrain, feet blistered and bleeding under worn boots. Each breath was agony, lungs ached, muscles trembled, yet stopping was impossible. Eyes of the instructors pierced every hesitation, and punishment followed instantly. Lashes, blows, or being forced to carry extra weight. Sleep was scarce, stolen in fragments between endless drills. Marcus began to feel his identity slip away, replaced by a nameless cog in the machinery of the Guard. Weakness was unforgivable. Those who faltered disappeared into the night, never remembered, their stories erased. Pain became a teacher, teaching endurance, obedience, and submission. Marcus realized survival was the only lesson that mattered. Everything else was illusion. Despite the cruelty, Marcus noticed fleeting moments of human connection. Brief glances of understanding between recruits, silent nods before drills, whispered encouragement during grueling exercises. Yet these sparks were fragile. Anyone too slow or too weak vanished without warning, leaving hollow spaces behind. Marcus clung to memories of home, a secret defiance, a tether to who he had been. But the relentless pressure of training pushed him further into exhaustion, shaping him into a tool. His body was raw, bruised, and trembling, but he marched. His ribs throbbed, his feet bled, yet he continued. By the end of the day, he scarcely recognized himself. The boy from the factory had been buried beneath layers of pain, fear, and obedience. Survival had reshaped him into something else, something the Imperium could use. Night fell like a shroud, yet rest did not come. Recruits were herded into darkened halls, where flickering propaganda films projected the Emperor as an omnipotent savior. His visage larger than life, flawless, untouchable. The images were meant to inspire, but Marcus felt only a hollow chill. Loudspeakers boomed with speeches about glory, duty, and sacrifice, contrasting violently with the bruised bodies and exhausted minds before him. Outside, parades marched in glittering order, banners waving under perfect light. But within the camp, the truth was naked brutality. Marcus's comrades were beaten for minor mistakes, screamed at for hesitation, and sometimes dragged off for punishment. Sleep deprivation gnawed at his mind. Chants filled every corridor, and every whispered confession of imagined crimes was enforced. Human life was expendable, a lesson drilled into his marrow. Marcus's thoughts began to fracture. Hours blurred into endless repetition of lectures, chants, and visual indoctrination. Each film looped images of heroic soldiers dying with honor, smiling under impossible odds. While outside the screen, recruits vomited from exhaustion or collapsed silently. The contrast between illusion and reality tore at his perception. Commissars circled, forcing confessions of guilt, real or imagined. And he saw how quickly fear reshaped minds. The indoctrination worked not through kindness, but through terror. Marcus's memories of home, of factory work, and simple comforts clung to him weakly, fading with each chant and each lash. He realized survival now meant obedience, mental and physical surrender, and that identity was a liability. By the fourth night, Marcus barely recognized his own reflection. Every sense was sharpened by fear, every movement dictated by anticipation of punishment. Instructors used sleep deprivation as a weapon, keeping minds pliable, unthinking, malleable. The chants became rhythm, hypnotic, embedding slogans. Glory is obedience, sacrifice is life, weakness is death. He watched comrades break down under the strain, tears mixed with blood and sweat, and realized that strength had become relative. Survival was no longer measured in endurance or skill alone, but in the ability to absorb pain, to accept brutality, to internalize propaganda as truth. Marcus felt the slow erosion of self, a transformation invisible but absolute. He was learning to become what the Imperium required: unquestioning, obedient, expendable. Even amidst torment, small rebellions flickered briefly in the mind. Thoughts of escape, of defiance, of clinging to personal memories surfaced like sparks in darkness. But each spark was snuffed out by the relentless weight of indoctrination. Marcus's mind had begun to obey before his body, repeating slogans, echoing phrases, believing what was drilled into him because resistance meant death. His soul, once private and human, now existed for the instruction, the punishment, the ritual of conversion. By the end of this stage, Marcus was no longer just a recruit. He was a vessel, filled with fear, obedience, and indoctrination, a shadow of the person who had stepped into the training grounds only days before. Survival demanded surrender, and surrender demanded everything. The morning air was thick with the metallic scent of lasgun oil and sweat as Marcus approached the weapons range. The instructors distributed lasguns with a mechanical precision, each rifle heavier than expected, yet they insisted on immediate mastery. Marcus's fingers ached as he cleaned, disassembled, and reassembled the weapon repeatedly, each mistake punished with lashes or shouted derision. The clang of metal echoed across the training grounds, mingling with groans of those less adept, whose fumbling cost them bruises or worse. Marcus focused on every detail: the alignment of the barrel, the tension of the spring, the weight of the trigger, understanding that in the coming days, a single error could mean death. He learned to balance urgency with caution, but the pace never slowed, and exhaustion gnawed at his concentration. Mistakes were noted and remembered. Field survival lessons were no less brutal. Marcus and his squad mates were taught to patch wounds quickly, to drag injured comrades, to identify edible plants in barren zones, and to navigate terrain with blind precision. Each exercise was a test of endurance as much as skill. Recruits failed, sometimes fatally. Marcus watched silently as one young man misjudged a climb, fell, and lay motionless until the instructors pronounced him dead. No lamentation followed. The dead were removed, as if they had never existed. These moments etched the harsh law of the Guard into Marcus's mind. Weakness equals death. Fear became as essential as breath. Each surviving recruit was forced to witness, to internalize, and to obey, understanding that hesitation was unforgivable. It was during these trials that Marcus met Tavian, a miner from a distant agri world, with a pronounced limp and a friendly, weary smile. Tavian moved slower than most, but displayed cunning in navigating obstacles. They became allies in silence, sharing whispered observations, brief encouragements, and small strategies for enduring the grueling exercises. Marcus admired his calm determination, noting how Tavian's mind compensated for his physical shortcomings. They endured forced marches, climbing drills, and simulated ambushes together. Tavian's quiet humor became a lifeline for Marcus in the relentless storm of pain and fear, a reminder of the humanity still clinging to the recruits. Yet the camp allowed no mercy, and every bond carried risk. The day of the final obstacle test arrived with grim inevitability. Recruits scrambled through mud, climbed walls, and carried heavy packs under the watchful gaze of the instructors. Tavian struggled, his bad leg lagging behind, slowing the pace of his group. Marcus's heart sank as the commissar's eyes fell on him. In a sudden, cold exercise of discipline, Tavian was pulled aside and executed without ceremony. Marcus could only watch, frozen, as his friend was shot for failing the standard. The screams echoed, mingling with the rhythmic chants of the indoctrination that had begun weeks earlier. Marcus felt the icy grip of comprehension. Survival demanded not just obedience, but the complete eradication of weakness, mercy, and sentiment. Each passing moment reinforced the lesson that in the Imperial Guard, humanity was a liability. From that day onward, Marcus moved with precision born of fear. He maintained his lasgun meticulously, patched his own wounds without hesitation, and obeyed every order without question. Sleep came less and less, stolen in moments between drills, each sliver of rest haunted by images of Tavian. The loss was a crucible, hardening Marcus into something more than human, a soldier conditioned to survive, to endure, and to obey without pause. Every muscle, every tendon, every thought bent toward one purpose: to endure. He no longer counted the hours. He counted only survival. He observed failures, memorized patterns, and anticipated punishment before it arrived. The training was no longer about skill alone. It was about reshaping the mind, embedding obedience, and suppressing instinct. By the end of the 6th week, Marcus had transformed. He could clean and fire his lasgun with blind precision, navigate the harshest terrain without error, and administer rudimentary medical aid under duress. He no longer flinched at punishment, no longer hesitated when ordered into exhaustion or pain. Every motion, every thought, every breath had been conditioned. Yet beneath this steel-clad exterior, a flicker of grief remained, a quiet memory of Tavian, of hope, and of a life that had been stolen. Marcus understood now that the Imperial Guard demanded absolute submission, and he had given it. Survival had been purchased with innocence, friendship, and the remnants of his soul. The lessons were clear: obey, endure, and let everything else die. He was no longer a factory worker. He was now the machinery of the Imperium, conditioned, sharpened, and prepared for the endless wars to come. The instructors gathered the recruits on a barren plateau, their shadows long in the smog-choked light. Marcus listened as they spoke of the machinery of the Imperial Guard, the vast systems that fed its soldiers without pause or mercy. Hive worlds, teeming with billions of bodies, supplied human wave after human wave. The population itself a weapon against the galaxy's enemies. Agri-worlds harvested farmers and laborers, turning them into expendable troops who obeyed orders without hesitation. Penal worlds delivered criminals and convicts, stripped of rights, thrown into the front lines to die for sins past. Marcus felt the enormity of it pressing down on him. The Imperium did not recruit, it consumed. Each lesson was a reminder that individual life held no value, only the ability to serve. He thought of the historical parallels the instructors drew, each chillingly familiar. The Great War on Terra, with endless human wave charges, mirrored the hive world tactics. Men ordered forward to die so others might survive. Soviet penal battalions, thrown into the deadliest fronts, were a lesson in cold pragmatism. Their sacrifice both unnoticed and uncelebrated. Conscription, press gangs, and child soldiers from humanity's past illuminated the universality of sacrifice and exploitation. Marcus understood the logic of the Imperium in a horrifying way. This was not cruelty for pleasure, but systematized necessity. The machinery of war demanded endless bodies, and history had already proven that humans could be molded into it. Marcus imagined the countless worlds, each pumping recruits into the endless front lines, the pattern repeating across light years. The scale was incomprehensible, yet each recruit was an individual, a mind, a life, a soul reduced to obedience. Hive world populations fed into the Guard as routinely as grain into mills. Farmers trained to wield rifles instead of plows. Criminals given one last chance at survival, always priced in blood. Marcus felt a creeping despair at his own place in this system. He was not special. He was part of a vast, grinding engine, a cog in a war that spanned galaxies. The instructors' voices faded into a haze, and all he could see were the countless bodies, countless deaths, countless sacrifices repeated endlessly, each identical yet tragic. Even as the lessons continued, Marcus noticed the subtle mechanics of indoctrination. The instructors compared doctrine to propaganda, history to training, emphasizing that belief and obedience were inseparable. Soldiers could not survive on skill alone. They required ideology, the internalization of service as sacred duty. Marcus recognized the manipulation of fear and pride. Knowing his life was expendable made each breath, each movement, more focused. Survival was not only physical, it was mental, and the teachings were designed to ensure obedience, even when instinct demanded otherwise. Marcus felt the weight of centuries of human behavior pressed into him, molded into compliance. The lectures drew dark parallels to child soldiers, men pressed into service before maturity, stripped of choice, identity, and hope. Marcus reflected on the prisoners he had seen in earlier weeks, and on his own transformation, noting how swiftly indoctrination could reshape a mind. History had offered countless examples, and the Imperium simply scaled them to galaxy-wide efficiency. Marcus realized that what he had experienced was part of a pattern older than the Emperor, older than the Guard itself, humans sacrificing humans, systems using life as fuel. The personal horror of Tavian's execution, the endless marches, the brutal drills were part of a universal truth. Marcus's thoughts spiraled as he connected past and present. Every battlefield, every penal colony, every conscripted child echoed in the vastness of the Imperium. He understood that these lessons were both cautionary and preparatory. Knowing the scale and history made survival logical, but it could not make it bearable. Life here was measured not by morality, nor by heroism, but by obedience and endurance. His mind worked mechanically now, cataloging lessons, recalling historical parallels, and noting patterns for survival. Compassion was dangerous, hesitation fatal. Humanity was optional, survival mandatory. By the end of the instruction, Marcus was not just trained physically, he was educated in the brutal arithmetic of the Imperium. The troopship was a coffin in motion. Marcus pressed his face to the cold metal wall, breathing recycled air, thick with the scent of sweat, oil, and fear. Recruits were crammed shoulder to shoulder, barely able to move. Every cough, every groan echoed in the metal hull like a prophecy of doom. Sleep was impossible, and rest came only in brief, terrified dozes. Marcus whispered prayers he didn't believe, murmurs of his factory, of home, of forgotten faces. The officers remained above in safety, shielded by reinforced compartments, their voices muffled through steel. Down here, the young soldiers were weightless instruments of the Imperium, bodies pressed into the machinery of war. Each heartbeat was a drum, counting down the hours to the front. The first glimpse of the alien sky stole Marcus's breath. Purple storms churned above a barren, cratered world, distant suns bleeding through thick clouds. Below, the landscape was a hellish canvas, scarred by past bombardments. The rivers running dark with mud and fire. Recruits pressed against the ship's portholes, silent and pale, mouths dry, eyes wide. Marcus felt an icy grip of dread curling through him, and he realized the propaganda of heroism had no place here. The real war was silent, patient, and inevitable. The sheer scale of the battlefield reduced thought to calculation. Survive, obey, endure. He gripped the rail as the ship shuddered, knowing the landing would spill them into chaos. Disembarkation was immediate and punishing. The ramp dropped, and the mud swallowed boots. Boots swallowed feet, and feet swallowed flesh. Marcus ran with the others into shallow trenches, lungs burning, muscles trembling. Artillery fire rumbled in the distance, like a living beast, shaking the earth beneath them. Officers shouted orders from bunkers safe above, while recruits scrambled below, exposed and fragile. Every motion was dictated by necessity, every breath a gamble. Marcus noticed the frightened faces of the men around him, some barely old enough to shave, others hardened by weeks of training, but all pale and trembling at the enormity of reality. Fear became the only currency that mattered. The trenches offered little comfort. Mud clung to every uniform, weighed down by rain and fear. Marcus ducked instinctively as a shell burst nearby, shrapnel cutting the air with a scream. Soldiers fell around him, faces twisted in pain and terror. He saw comrades he had trained with for weeks collapse instantly, their blood mingling with the mud. The reality of war replaced any notion of glory. Marcus's hands shook as he held his lasgun. Each shot fired a mix of instinct and necessity. The sounds were overwhelming. Screams, artillery, the snapping of timber, the hissing of lasfire. His body moved before his mind could process, a machine honed by weeks of brutal conditioning. Survival was instinct, obedience, and reflex. Amid the chaos, Marcus observed the scale of the Imperial apparatus. Officers directed fire from fortified bunkers, safe and detached, while the recruits became expendable extensions of strategy. Each regiment was a stream of humanity, flowing into death and destruction with mechanical inevitability. Marcus understood that his life was merely a cog in the vast engine of the Imperium, his survival not guaranteed by skill or valor, but by chance and the suppression of weakness. The alien sky above, the scorched terrain below, the cries of the dying around him, and the oppressive command structures made it clear. The propaganda of honor was meaningless in the mud. Even as he ran, fired, and endured, Marcus's mind grasped at fragments of humanity. He thought of Tavian, of the friends already lost, of his family and factory home. But the battlefield allowed no sentiment. Only focus, precision, and survival mattered. Every command was obeyed instantly, every error punished silently or lethally. Fear had become a tool as sharp as any weapon, a teacher that demanded total submission. Marcus realized that the front did not forgive mistakes. It erased lives without ceremony. By the end of the day, he was no longer merely a recruit. He was a living instrument of the Imperium, trained in obedience, fear, and survival, ready to be consumed by the war. The first attack came without warning, a sudden eruption of violence that shattered all pretense of training. Chaos cultists poured over the ridges, their faces twisted in manic rage, weapons flashing with a deadly zeal. Marcus froze for a fraction of a second before muscle memory took over. Lasgun raised, finger on the trigger. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid tang of burning metal and scorched flesh. Screams filled the trenches, guttural and raw, cutting through the rhythm of fear that had been drilled into him. He saw limbs blown apart, comrades torn to pieces, and civilians pressed into the front lines, dying instantly. The ground itself seemed alive, trembling beneath artillery strikes that shook him to the core. Marcus fired instinctively, each shot a mechanical repetition of drills he had learned. Yet the reality was far harsher than any training exercise. Around him, soldiers he had marched, sweated, and bled with for 8 weeks fell in seconds, faces contorted in terror. The screams of the dying filled his ears, blending with the thunder of explosions. Blood sprayed the mud, soaking uniforms, searing the senses with shock. Marcus ducked instinctively as a shell detonated nearby, the blast shaking him violently. Time fragmented into endless instants of survival. Inhale, fire, dive, reload, survive. The battlefield was indiscriminate, sparing none, and he realized the propaganda of heroism was meaningless here. The chaos was suffocating. Marcus saw recruits crushed under debris, others blinded by smoke and fire, their panic contagious. The training that had seemed impossible now sustained him. He moved with purpose, a series of motions honed into reflex, reacting before thought. Every command, every tactic became secondary to the primal need to survive. He glimpsed officers safely observing from bunkers above, their detachment a bitter reminder of the expendability of his life. Survival was not about glory or honor. It was about endurance, precision, and suppression of fear. Each second was a negotiation with death, each breath a borrowed gift. Amid the violence, Marcus felt a numbness creep over him. His emotions, once raw and human, began to dull under the onslaught. He watched a friend go down, blood pooling around him, and felt only the mechanical calculation of whether to help or keep moving. He could no longer distinguish between comrade and stranger. The lines had blurred in mud, fire, and screaming. Shell shock began to gnaw at his mind, the sensory overload so complete it fractured thought. Marcus's vision tunneled, each explosion a drumbeat, each scream a reminder of the futility of hesitation. The battle was not a story, it was an equation: act or die. The battlefield pressed every lesson he had learned into action. Weakness was annihilated, hesitation punished instantly. He saw civilians pressed into service, their ineptitude a deadly liability. Every failure, every misstep was fatal. Marcus's training, the weeks of pain, indoctrination, and survival drills had prepared him only partially. Reality demanded more than obedience. It demanded instinct, endurance, and a suppression of empathy. He realized that survival came at the cost of humanity. Those who faltered, who hesitated, were gone, leaving only the efficient, the ruthless, and the conditioned. Marcus felt the first flickers of the emptiness that would define him in the weeks and months ahead. By the end of the engagement, Marcus was alive, but changed irreversibly. His hands were trembling, stained with blood, and his ears rang from the explosions. He had survived, yet survival had erased innocence, compassion, and recognition of self. Every glance at fallen comrades was a reminder that the line between life and death was thinner than skin. The battlefield had replaced propaganda with reality, heroism with blood, mud, and unrelenting horror. Marcus's eyes, once alert and human, now reflected a blank, calculating stare, trained for survival, conditioned for obedience. Death had become ordinary, and he had become a vessel for it. Marcus stumbled through the mud and wreckage, his body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. The cries of the fallen echoed endlessly in his ears, a chorus that would never leave him. Each breath was shallow, ragged, and heavy with the smell of blood, smoke, and decay. The men he had trained with for weeks were gone, their faces burned into memory as fleeting specters. His lasgun felt heavier now, a weight not of metal, but of lives carried silently on his conscience. Marcus realized that survival was not triumph, but a slow erosion of the self. The boy who had stepped onto the training grounds was gone, replaced by a hollow figure forged in terror and necessity. Every instinct honed in training screamed at him to keep moving, to obey, to endure. Marcus's body ached from relentless exertion. Muscles tore, ribs throbbed, and every step sent fresh waves of pain through his frame. Yet his mind moved differently, mechanically cataloging the dead and injured, noting hazards, and calculating the next action. Emotion was suppressed, a dangerous luxury he could not afford. He realized that the cost of surviving the front was invisibly high. Every heartbeat came at the price of memory, empathy, and the capacity for joy. The lessons of indoctrination and physical torment had merged into a singular principle: obedience, endurance, survival above all else. The faces of the dead haunted Marcus, a silent accusation that pressed on his chest. He had once been human, capable of hope, fear, and compassion. But those qualities had been ground down under weeks of training and hours of combat. Each memory of friends lost, each scream that pierced his ears, contributed to a slow numbing. He no longer cried, no longer screamed, no longer thought of heroism. Survival was no longer a victory. It was merely the continuation of suffering. Marcus understood now that every soldier the Imperium produced was a ghost before the fact, molded to endure, conditioned to obey, and stripped of individuality. As Marcus moved through the trenches, he caught glimpses of other survivors, each face blank, eyes distant, bodies trembling. They were like him, living instruments, hollowed and efficient. No words were exchanged. Communication was unnecessary. Each understood instinctively the heavy, invisible price of being alive when so many had died around them. Marcus's thoughts returned to Tavian and the others, to the countless unnamed recruits lost to the unforgiving calculus of survival. Each memory added weight, a burden pressing down on him, yet also a strange anchor. He lived not because he was strong or deserving, but because the machinery of the Imperium had spared him. Survival was arbitrary, cruel, and absolute. As Marcus moved through the trenches, he caught glimpses of other survivors, each face blank, eyes distant, bodies trembling. They were, even as exhaustion threatened to collapse him, Marcus forced one more step. He realized the transformation was complete. The person who had once been Marcus Halder, factory worker, brother, dreamer, no longer existed. What remained was a soldier conditioned to obey, trained to alike him, living instruments, hollowed and efficient. No words were exchanged. Communication was unnecessary. Each understood instinctively the heavy, invisible price of being alive when so many had died around them. Marcus's thoughts returned to Tavian and the others, to the countless unnamed recruits lost to the unforgiving calculus of survival. Each memory added weight, a burden pressing down on him, yet also a strange anchor. He lived not because he was strong or deserving, but because the machinery of the Imperium had spared him. Survival was arbitrary, cruel, and absolute. By the end of these 2 hours, Marcus was alive, yet the price was staggering. His identity had been erased, replaced by a functional, obedient, and conditioned shell. He no longer remembered who he had been, who he had loved, or what he had valued. All that remained was a body and mind tuned for survival, a mind stripped of sentiment, prepared to endure endless wars. He whispered under his breath, voice hoarse and trembling, "I don't remember who I was before this." The battlefield had claimed more than life. It had claimed the very essence of humanity, leaving behind a soldier, a living instrument of the Imperium, forged in pain, fear, and blood. The battlefield fell silent around Marcus, though the echoes of screams lingered in his ears, ghostly and insistent. Smoke rose from scorched earth, the mud was thick with blood, and the distant alien sky bled colors he could not name. Every sense was overloaded, yet nothing penetrated the numbness that had claimed his mind. Survival had transformed him utterly. He was no longer a factory worker, no longer a brother, no longer human in the way he once had been. The men and women he had trained with, laughed with, and bled alongside were gone, leaving empty spaces filled with grief and dread. Marcus stood alone, a witness to the cost of obedience and endurance, understanding fully the machinery of the Imperium. Every lesson, every drill, every punishment converged into clarity. The Imperial Guard did not make heroes, it made survivors. Ordinary humans were broken, molded, and conditioned to obey, to endure, to function as living ammunition in the endless wars of the galaxy. Marcus's body was raw, his mind fatigued, yet he understood the depth of the transformation. Emotion had been stripped, replaced with calculation and reflex. Every glance at the ruined landscape reminded him that survival was arbitrary, that compassion was a liability, and that mercy had no place. He felt his identity slipping further, leaving only the shell the Imperium demanded. Memories surfaced, fragile and painful, of simpler lives before the drills, before the indoctrination, before the slaughter. Faces of family, friends, and comrades flashed through his mind, each one a reminder of what had been lost. He remembered Tavian, the miner whose life had been erased for weakness, and countless others whose names would never be spoken again. The weight of these memories pressed down, yet he did not cry. Grief had become a distant echo. The machinery of survival had replaced feeling with purpose. Marcus realized he could no longer distinguish between self and tool, between thought and action. The Guard demanded total submission, and he had delivered. Even as he moved through the ruined trenches, observing what remained of his regiment, Marcus felt a cold internal reckoning. The propaganda, the drills, the relentless training, they had been accurate in their promise. The Imperial Guard consumed life, bending men and women into weapons, erasing individuality, forging obedience. There was no heroism here, no glory, only survival, and the price was absolute: the surrender of identity, the suppression of empathy, the erasure of humanity. Marcus understood finally that this was the truth no one wanted to tell new recruits. To serve was not to fight, it was to be broken and rebuilt into a tool of war. As he trudged through the mud, every step was a reminder of endurance, every breath a testament to the human capacity for adaptation. Marcus's thoughts were stripped bare, reflecting only the logic of survival and obedience. Yet even in this mechanical state, the enormity of the cost struck him. His eyes, once alive with curiosity and fear, now mirrored the battlefield, empty, hollow, focused. He was aware of the transformation, and the quiet despair of understanding settled over him like a shroud. The training, the combat, the indoctrination, all of it had prepared him not for heroism, but for survival in its most brutal, unfeeling form. In the final moments, Marcus paused and whispered to himself, barely audible over the silence of the destroyed landscape. The Guard doesn't make soldiers, it makes survivors. It takes men and women and grinds them into the meat of the Imperium's wars. We are no longer civilians. We are no longer human. We are ammunition. The words felt hollow, yet true, resonating in the emptiness of his mind. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the weight of the realization settle fully, understanding that nothing would ever return him to who he had been. The battlefield, the training, and the loss had claimed everything but life itself. Marcus opened his eyes again to the desolate horizon. The alien sky burned with the light of dying suns, casting long shadows across the mud and blood. Silence hung heavy, yet it was not peace. It was the pause before another assault, another endless cycle of survival and obedience. He felt the final truth embed itself in his bones. The Imperial Guard did not care for heroism, for valor, for individuality. It demanded submission, endurance, and the complete surrender of self. Marcus had survived. He was alive, but in surviving, he had been remade. He was no longer the man who had stepped onto the training grounds weeks ago. He was an instrument of war, a ghost of humanity, and a witness to the Imperium's endless hunger. As the smoke of battle slowly cleared, Marcus Halder stood among the ruins, the silence almost unbearable after the deafening chaos. The mud, blood, and wreckage clung to him like a second skin, a reminder of the lives extinguished and the horrors endured. His hands were raw, his uniform torn, yet his mind was the heaviest burden. Weeks of training, indoctrination, and combat had transformed him into something unrecognizable. The echoes of screams, the crushing weight of loss, and the cold, mechanical obedience instilled in him reverberated through his thoughts. He realized fully that survival had come at the price of everything that once made him human. Marcus reflected on Tavian, on the friends whose names were now forgotten, erased by the relentless machinery of the Imperium. Each life lost was a lesson, each death a demonstration of the cruel arithmetic of war. The propaganda, the drills, and the indoctrination had not prepared him for the reality of survival. The cost was soul deep. He understood that ordinary humans were not forged into heroes in the Guard, but molded into instruments of death, conditioned to obey without hesitation. Memory, emotion, and individuality were luxuries, stripped away to create soldiers who could endure anything, obey everything, and sacrifice themselves without question. Looking across the battlefield, Marcus saw the scars of war etched into every crater, every broken weapon, and every body strewn across the mud. The officers above had survived safely, detached and calculating, while the recruits bore the brunt of chaos, pain, and death. This disparity was a stark reminder of the Imperium's priorities. The machinery of war valued efficiency over life, obedience over heroism, and survival over morality. Marcus felt a hollow pride, not for what he had achieved, but for having endured. He was alive, yet every fragment of his former self had been stripped away, leaving only the vessel the Imperium required. Even amidst this grim reflection, a quiet awareness emerged. Marcus understood the scale of the universe, the vastness of the Imperium, and the countless billions who had endured similar fates. Hive worlds, agri-worlds, and penal colonies fed the endless tide of soldiers into the front lines. Each individual life reduced to numbers and statistics. History had repeated itself countless times. Human waves, penal battalions, child soldiers, all echoed in the machinery of the Imperial Guard. Marcus felt both insignificance and unity. He was a single cog in a galaxy-spanning engine, Yet he carried within him the experience and memory of survival, a testament to the resilience of human will, even under unimaginable horror. As Marcus's breathing steadied, he considered what it truly meant to serve the Imperium. Glory, heroism, and honor were illusions, carefully cultivated to sustain obedience. Reality demanded sacrifice, endurance, and submission. He knew that those who faltered were gone, and those who survived were forever changed. The transformation was complete. The factory worker, the dreamer, the human being he once was, no longer existed. In its place stood a soldier conditioned to obey, to endure, and to survive. Every scar, every bruise, every memory of loss was etched into him, shaping him into a living testament to the terrifying efficiency of the Imperial Guard. Marcus finally turned his gaze toward the horizon, the alien sky still burning with distant suns. Silence hung over the battlefield, not as peace, but as a fragile reprieve before the next wave of combat. The Imperium's hunger was endless, and he knew that survival was only temporary, a fleeting reprieve in an eternal cycle of war. Yet in that moment of reflection, he acknowledged the truth. Survival had reshaped him, not as a hero, but as a witness to the hidden horrors of the Imperium. He whispered to himself, a statement both resigned and defiant. I survived, but I am no longer human. I am the weapon they made me to be.